This next panel is titled The Role of OSINT in Future Competition and Conflict, and it will be moderated by the Special Operation Associations of America's Executive Director, David Cook. David served in the Army for more than 10 years in both conventional and special operation units before becoming a senior policy advisor to Congressman Issa. In addition to being our Executive Director, David currently writes policy and develops strategy for the Army's OSINT office. So I will turn it over to David.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Emily Harding served several positions in the intelligence community since 2003, including the NSC and special advisors to the DNI's presidential transition team from 2008 to 2009. She's also a professional staffer at the Senate Select Committee on Intel for 6 years. She's currently the Deputy Director of International Security Program at Center for Strategic and Intelligence. I'm sorry.
It's a very long title.
Yeah,
Center for
CSIS.
Strategic and International Studies. There you go.
Everybody knows what CSIS is. We've got Doug Livermore, as a senior officer in the Army, serving as Green Beret in the National Guard, Irregular Warfare Initiative Fellow, board member of Special Operations Association of America, and current director of Special Operations, Irregular Warfare and Sensitive Activities for the U.S. Navy. Chris Miller, the Honorable Chris Miller, served 27 years in the U.S. Army, with most of his time in 5th Special Forces Group. Following his retirement from the military, he served in multiple positions in the NSC, director of the NCTC, and finally the acting Secretary of Defense. So really what you need to know about Mr. Miller is that he walked into a recruiting station at 17, ended as acting Secretary of Defense.
Only in America. That can be a good thing or a bad thing.
Author of the
Dude, you're giving me a book pitch? That's awesome.
I love it.
This
Soldier
was not
Secretary.
planned. David, you're the best, man. I owe you. I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if I got a book pitch out of this? But I was like, I'm going to be professional. I was thinking about bringing my book. This is not my book. This is a good book.
It is a good book. My mom is reading this book, and she loves it.
She getting a laugh out of it?
She is. Yeah. If you have ever served in the military, I see, you're going to laugh at this book. It's pretty funny. All right. Let's get started. So everybody here has been operational at some point, and I want to open up with some personal experiences with open source intelligence. So you were all practitioners, or still are in some cases, in the military intelligence field. Can you talk about an experience you've had with OSINT that led to success or failure?
Ooh, pregnant pause. Ooh, who goes first?
I can start. I'm to the left of the moderator, which is usually where they look first. So I will start. So my experience with OSINT, I think, shaped my view of how important OSINT is to do in a rigorous way using appropriate tradecraft. So when I was an analyst at CIA, we were constantly being called upon to write really in-depth analysis on breaking news. Well, that's almost impossible to do, right? At the same time as we were told, we need your insights for tomorrow morning's PDB on this thing that just blew up in the Middle East, we were told, don't try to be CNN. Well, what am I going to say in that PDB? What in-depth strategic analysis can I provide on something that happened 6 hours ago when none of my clandestine sources have had an opportunity to report in? So I'm basically reframing what CNN said, sometimes with much better insight into the long sweep of history. But that kind of competition is just it's not healthy or useful, and it's certainly not useful for the president. My other shaping experience, I was, as you mentioned, a staffer on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and as such, I have these members to take care of who are walking into a highly classified briefing and then walking out that door and having a reporter shove a microphone in their face and saying, "What did you learn?" And there's so little that they can actually say about what they heard in the room. However, they can't say nothing. So part of my job was always to help them frame a comment that protected sources and methods, that didn't reveal anything classified, but gave them something that they could show to their constituents. And in a sense, I was a very poor man's OSINT analyst in those circumstances, where I was looking for anything that I could find that they could actually say out loud. And I think that those experiences really got me to the point where I am today, where I acknowledge that there is so much that you can find in the open source world that is interesting and useful and timely in a way that intelligence in the classified realm needs to compete with, but sort of in a complementary way, not in a competition way.
For those of you that know me, you will not be surprised. For those of you that don't know me, you'll be horrified. I didn't really understand truly what open source intelligence was until the last panel, which gave a really cogent, I thought, insight. So I can't answer the question because I didn't know what OSINT was when I was in the service and when I was a civilian employee of our government. Interestingly enough, I realize now I did 30-something years in the Army and Special Operations, and I saw one finished intelligence product from the National Intelligence Product. You get like SIGINT reports and all that. I'm talking about like finished intelligence. Then I showed up at the National Security Council, and I'm exposed to the Presidential Daily Brief and all these. What's up, man? I can't believe you're here. Nice seeing you. And then all of a sudden, so I'm getting exposed to all this great, top-level intelligence. And my experience with OSINT wasn't really OSINT now. I realized it was publicly available information, but the best source of information I got on domestic terrorism was an article in the New York Times Magazine about the Proud Boys, which was a long-form piece. And then Karen Bilew, I don't know if I pronounced her name right, Belew, she wrote a book about Bring the War Home that was published, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago that really talked about domestic extremism and everything. So those really became my touchstones as I moved forward on that portfolio, which I think kind of summarizes the challenge we're having right now with deciding what OSINT is and how we parcel out publicly available information. I learned a new one today. What was another one? Commercially available?
Yeah, commercially available information.
Who's been in the IC field here? Hey, last panel brought it up best, didn't they? They're like, who joined the intelligence service to be an open source analyst? No, everybody wants access to the secrets, right? You want secret intelligence. I mean, come on. Like, you would have stayed at grad school or a PhD program and just stayed at academia if you wanted to be an OSINT analyst. And for those that are here from Congress, at the end of the day, in closing, the only way that the industry, the IC is going to change is through your involvement in changing the incentive system. Because right now, I love the last panel, great points. But until we incentivize open source intelligence, it's always going to be kind of like a third-rate thing. And that was my point about the books and the magazines articles I read, was those were more academic, and our Wall Street Journal colleague, well, he's not a colleague, Wall Street Journal guy who was here really summed it up best. So that's kind of my lame answer to what's OSINT. Doug, you need to clean this one up. Clean up after me, man.
I'll do my best. And
as you always did in the past.
No, not at all. But building off of the previous two panelists, particularly Emily's points about the timeliness and the ability to share open source intelligence more readily, that was certainly something in my experience at various points in my military and government career I've certainly come to appreciate as a consumer of open source intelligence. To the point of working with partners and allies, oftentimes, whereas as the U.S. service member or government employee, like Mr. Boreen was saying in the previous panel, like we want that thing that's the top secret SCI with all the caveats because we know that's the really good stuff. The problem is at the end of the day, that's not the stuff that we can generally share with our partners and allies downrange. And in my experiences, having deployed 7 times in uniform to a bunch of great spots around the world, my partners needed that information, or needed information rapidly in order to drive their own operations. And OSINT provided those opportunities where I could, as long as the OSINT was similar enough to what I had seen in the classified realm, I could share the OSINT with some confidence on my part that it was going to be useful. The one vignette that I was going to offer that really resonates with me is in 2011, I was in northern Mali, which at the time was under government control. Bamako actually had some level of governance up there, and we were working with the Malian army up there some former Tuareg rebels that joined the military through one of the peace accords, and we're currently engaged in a pitched battle against Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Now, as the Special Forces Detachment Commander assigned to conduct a training event up there with my partner force, I had access to everything, at least at my site, all the way up through the secret level, and I could go down to Bamako and get the TS stuff. But I couldn't share any of that with my partners. And when we were starting to take a look at analysis on caravan routes, the illicit and terrorist smuggling routes through northern Mali, through Timbuktu region, which, by the way, Timbuktu is a real thing, if you didn't already know, we could take that OSINT, there were some OSINT products that were comported closely enough with what we were tracking through our sensitive reporting on what the caravan routes were, where the major watering holes were that AQIM and other terrorist organizations were using, and share that or direct our partners to that with reasonable certainty that it was going to get them about 95% of where they wanted to be. And what we saw in the weeks and months following the end of the training exercise and our partner force went back to Timbuktu is they actually made some fairly significant interdictions against AQIM caravans all across their region. So that was just an instance in which I saw OSINT applied successfully.
Amazing. All right, let's build on that just for a second. So OSINT is growing, there's no doubt about that. And particularly, I'm looking at other intelligence disciplines, especially signals intelligence and geospatial intelligence. If I can go to a company that can get net flow data that was previously highly classified and now it's open, if I can go to Maxar or Planet Labs and get geospatial intelligence and in an open source environment, isn't that open source? And why do we care about the intelligence disciplines? And I'll add to that, just because we're on a truncated schedule. Between intelligence and operations, why should we care? Can't we merge all that together? Our adversaries don't care. Why should we?
Why are you looking at me? Emily's next to you.
So it's kind of an interesting question. Why do we care? I mean, we don't care which information comes from which source, in the sense that if it gets the job done, it gets the job done. And I grew up, like I said, as an analyst at CIA, where we were supposed to be all-source analysts and doing all-source intelligence. Well, if you're not paying attention to OSINT, then you're not doing all-source. At the same time, some of the strictures around what you can access from inside the building makes it very difficult to do that kind of open-source work. And then on top of that, a lot of the contracts that you have things like limited licenses, where maybe these 5 people can actually access everything that Maxar has, and they have to go through certain restrictions before they share it on. And I pick on Maxar, but from the business perspective, that makes business sense. From an intelligence perspective, it's anathema to the way that we do our work, because it's all about information sharing and getting the information from where it is to where it needs to be. So yes, in an ideal world, you would have this huge reserve of information, and you could go play anywhere in that lake and pull what you need to get things done at the time you need them done. I think we still have a way to go as the U.S. government to try to break down some of those walls in a safe way that still protects IP for businesses, but then allows people to actually get what they need. And you're right, I mean, when Beijing calls any company that is Chinese and asks for something, they don't go, well, first please sign this contract and sign this NDA. It's just theirs. I don't think we need to be that, but I do think we need to think about what we're up against.
David, did you know that I was an intelligence oversight inspector? I was down on my luck. I was kind of down on my luck. Doug and I were contracting together at the Pentagon. I was like, I need a real job. This contracting hustle is a hoot, but it's not really predictable. Kid in college.
We just lost half the audience.
So I end up taking a job in the Pentagon as an intelligence oversight official. And I was like a 5219. It was some code which was inspector. And I realized it was the same code. I could have been a meat inspector, a railroad inspector. So your intelligence oversight inspector has the same code. And so I kind of learned all about 12333 and dug in. Here's my point. It's been 50 years. Swede brought up on the last panel, church pipe hearings. It's been 50 years since we cleaned up the IC. Some people will claim, oh, we did that with after September 11th with establishment of DNI. I don't think we did that. I think it's time for a complete rewrite. We're still stuck in a Cold War mentality, and the technology and everything that you all are aware of is absolutely hindering us right now. We heard the last two panels talk about process, procedures, programmatics, and all that. We need to clean this thing out. We need to reset the IC for the future, because right now we're getting our you-know-what's handed to us. And I'm avidly, violently supportive of protecting American civil liberties. There's a way to do it, but by the same token, so much of this is available. We can do it right here, right now.
So I had the privilege most of last year of serving overseas in Iraq as the deputy commander for the Special Operations Advisory Group, working with the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service and some of our other partners in the region, Syrians and Kurds and whatnot. And one of the things that we really focused on was how could we speed the intel to ops cycle. So as I know most of us in this room are security or national security professionals, we understand intel drives ops. And what I always saw, particularly as we started to look at the integration of, say, commercially available information or publicly available information, and the synthesis of that into OSINT that we could share with our partners, kind of building off of my previous comments, that was where we were able to gain efficiencies in rapidly sharing the necessary information up front with our partners so that they could start planning their operations. That would then allow us the time that if we needed to, we could go through the declassification process for some of the more exquisite, interesting intelligence that then would generally reinforce and provide some more specificity to what our partners were already operating off of from the OSINT that we shared previously. So when I start thinking about particularly this question of, I agree, I don't think it should really matter. I think that we should look at these various intelligence disciplines as complementary and seek those opportunities to use OSINT in a way that speeds up the overall process. Because not just in the CT fight, I think most of us up here at the table who have been involved in the CT fight for the last couple decades are really focused on that F3 EAD, find, fix, finish, exploit, disseminate. And that does apply in a more, I'd say where we find ourselves now, great power competition. It's just overall a more laborious process because you're talking about like national level intelligence and really getting into some of those exquisite sources and methods. So just to reemphasize, yeah, I think OSINT, knock down those barriers. I think everyone up here already said that, and look at how we can exploit that to speed the entire process.
But Doug, with let's say you can do battle damage, you can do battle tracking right now. You can see how your operation's going in real time by just monitoring social media. Is that OSINT or is that something else? I still don't know because, I mean,
it's information. I mean, just like information
I
is not
bet you
intelligence.
intelligence oversight people would have a different ruling on that.
Hey, that's your world.
I know, I was an inspector, by the way. If you want your rail car inspected, come talk to me.
So this is the dilemma, right? Because if you're doing operations and you're just monitoring the information environment, that's not intelligence, right?
Right.
I mean, so if you're, we got around it because as a former PSYOP in USASOC, we did, we monitored the information environment. That's not intelligence. We weren't intelligence people. We weren't doing intelligence work. That's the way it goes. We can immediately operationalize that information because we were looking at Twitter as we were running through Syria or wherever. So, but yeah.
The line of where information becomes intelligence is very fuzzy. Anybody can read something that happens on Twitter. Trying to figure out, is this legitimate, is just normal critical thinking. Trying to add value to it and to put it into a bigger context and try to operationalize it, that to me is intelligence. And there's no clear line. There's no, when you go to intelligence school, they don't say, okay, here is where you live. They basically tell you, here are the sources of information available to you. Think critically, ask questions, try to evaluate alternatives, and then that is how you add value.
I thought intelligence was supposed to inform policymakers. Okay, go ahead.
Of course it does. Of course.
So real quickly,
There is a purpose, yes.
I would also offer that there's certainly, I think, flexibility that maintaining that fuzziness allows. Chris, I'm sure you can appreciate this as a former SIOO, that insofar as oversight ensures that American civil liberties are protected. Outside of that, I'm not particularly wrapped around the axle as to whether or not something is information or intelligence.
You're just a knuckle dragger.
That's fair.
I didn't know this was going to be a roast.
We haven't gotten to the roast yet. But, okay, next questions, because we're truncated on time. Okay, Ukraine. All right, we got some experts up here. We're seeing the power of open source information, not intelligence, play out in real time, shaping the battlefield. Ukraine has effectively crowdsourced this conflict. What's next in the information space, and what can we learn about Ukrainians, or from the Ukrainians who are adapting in incredible ways?
What we can learn about the Ukrainians is they are adapting in incredible ways. That's absolutely true. I think this is a classic example of making it work with what you have. You know, to butcher Rumsfeld, you go to war with the information that you have. And they, I think, have been a real example of how you can take a million tiny pieces of information and knowing the terrain as well as they know their home terrain, put that to good use for targeting purposes. And it's been, you know, breathtaking to see. I think this is going to be the future of warfare when you're fighting on your own turf.
I would just push back slightly, because I think what oftentimes gets lost in this entire conversation about how successful the Ukrainians have been in defending their own country has been the amount of preparation that went into getting them to that place. So we see what's occurring today. You know, thank you. Going back to 2014 when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, and then back to the Russian separatists that then cropped up in Donbas. That was really the clarion call for a lot in the West. The United States and some of our really committed allies and partners then went in and undertook a very holistic approach to helping the Ukrainians reform their military, get their conventional forces reorganized, take their special operations forces and their territorial forces, and basically set them up to conduct unconventional warfare in the event of an expanded invasion by Russia, but then really also work in the information space in their intelligence collection. And again, so that we're talking about, I can do math, 6, 7, 8 years.
Don't do public math.
Yeah, 8 years.
Not on a panel.
8 years of preparation. Special Operations Command Europe with some of our NATO partners actually published the resistance operating concept in 2019, which was largely based off of a lot of the experiences gained through working with the Ukrainians. And so not to take anything away from the Ukrainians, they've done an absolutely amazing job. They've shown themselves to be incredibly adaptable. But I just think it's important to note that a lot of these successes, both on the battlefield and in the information space, have largely been made possible through all the preparation activities and the support that they had got from the international community, to the point that, you know, the lead up to Russia's accelerated invasion in February of 2022 was basically like we and the Ukrainians were out basically beating the Russians to the punch each and every time. The Russians started in the information space talking about the atrocities being committed against Russian minorities in eastern Ukraine. They started talking about, well, we're just doing large-scale training operations in Belarus. Meanwhile, at the same time, you had the Ukrainians and the U.S. and our partners and allies just outpacing them and releasing intelligence quickly, relying on OSINT to get out into the narrative space. So by the time the Russians actually came across the border in February, the rest of the world was largely unified or starting to come together around Ukraine and rejecting the narrative being put out by the Russian Federation.
I thought, this kind of meets with your psychological operations, information operations stuff. Is that where you wanted to take this? Because it's really, I guess open source is directly connected. My lesson from the Ukraine is the way they use the information environment is that's the way we're supposed to do it. In the United States, unless something's changed dramatically in the last 2 years and 4 months or something, we are literally, can you be before the Stone Age, like pre-Stone Age? Because that's where we are, and I don't think there's been any major breakthrough in how we are organized or our authorities. As a matter of fact, I think it's even getting more kludged up. So my takeaway from the Ukraine, it just reinforces my horrible fear that we're not even close. The answer, though, I would argue, is in the commercial environment. I think if we continue to outsource, but then you get into your oversight mechanisms, because it will go bad. But if you plan that into the thing, because we've seen great success. I think everybody on the panel has seen great success when we outsource it to a commercial entity, but I have not seen the United States government. I can't speak for the covert action stuff, because obviously that wasn't my field, but I can speak definitively for the Department of Defense that except for these few pockets of excellence, which typically are younger people that are technologically sophisticated, that aren't gummed up in the machine, and are given like latitude and authority to go make magic happen, because generally it's because we're so messed up and we just are desperate for help, and we, in that crisis, you know, people rise to the fore. But that's, my takeaway from Ukraine is we're completely not ready for that type of warfare, which is it's not the future of warfare, it's warfare that's happening now.
Okay, what needs to change? And then there's a recent Army document that came out called Open Source Intelligence, a team sport. Talked about building bridges with industry, with academia. How do we do that?
I didn't get a great feeling of confidence, at least in the government, trying to figure out what this looks like. All the more reason to reach out to commercial sector, academia, and whatnot. But at the end of the day, let's be clear: the team sport is congressional, all the three branches of government, and there's no consensus right now on what that looks like. And we will have a digital or an information operations Pearl Harbor, and then we'll get it right. We all know how to do it. You guys know how to do it in the crowd. Like, how hard is this? Okay, we're going to, there's always the argument. We're not going to, what Gates did his article, what was that? The Wall Street Journal, the Post the other day. Bob Gates had somebody wrote it for him, obviously, but nonetheless, it was a thought-provoking article, but I don't think it was anything new. It was like, yeah, his thing was like, everybody wants to set up the United States Information Agency again. We shouldn't do that. Okay, change the name, but we need to have some coordinating body right now, and it doesn't exist. I thought, his recommendation is pull it up to the executive level, kind of do it like the Office of Strategic Services of old, and put it before it got subsumed by the Department of Defense, which wasn't the Department of Defense then, it was the War Department. We need to have a executive level organization that focuses on it, that's multifaceted, much like the Office of Strategic Services was, that has, here's the key thing, direct access to senior decision makers and leaders, AKA the President of the United States, and then we'll sort it out then.
Whatever this center looks like, I definitely agree that it has to be a public-private partnership. However,
no, it needs to be private-public.
Private-public, right.
Because if it's public-private, right away that diminishes, we need to flip the model, man. Sorry, Doug. Sorry, you triggered me, dude.
No, nope, that's an important nuance. Good distinction. But to the point where I think the other danger is we outsource far too much of this and make it all a private thing. I agree, most of the innovation is occurring in the private sector. I do think that there needs to be a public component to that. And I also wholeheartedly agree that we shouldn't park this information center or this OSINT center down at one of the existing agencies. At a minimum, I know we were talking a little bit about the Office of the Director of National Intelligence previously. I think somewhere reporting through ODNI directly to the NSC and the White House is probably the right way to go, particularly to avoid where we've seen some of the other challenges where if another agency gets a hold of something, then they become another pass-through, and that leads to some bureaucratic hurtles, but yeah.
I completely disagree, and I think that it should not be its own agency. I think if it's its own agency, it'll never be taken seriously. Instead, the model that we have right now, where you have the open source enterprise that is trying to do two things at the same time. It is trying to create really rigorous tradecraft in the open source space, and then at the same time embed those analysts in various parts of the agency and around the intelligence community, so they can demonstrate the value that open source brings to the table. And that's how you get open source bylines in PDBs, and that's how you get taken seriously.
If you go back and look at Daryl Issa's 2021 EDGE speech, he talked about America becoming a leader in data. What if this was housed in the legislative branch, in Congress? There's already CRS, there's already, some nonpartisan, but that's for you to think about. Okay. tell all the IC folks in the room why or why not ChatGPT is going to take their analyst jobs.
I mean, I think it's not. As the resident analyst on the panel, so I wrote a paper a year ago called Oscar, and it talks about the combination of open source intelligence, AI, and then making use of the cloud to do some of the jobs that analysts do now. And the pitch in that was the picture of Tony Stark and his assistant Jarvis, and having somebody who could basically sit next to you and help you process some of the data that you needed to process quickly. And I think that is the model, that is the future. I would love it if my analyst didn't have to stay at work all night in the middle of a crisis to write an EU that a machine could have written probably 80% of. I would rather they come in at 3 in the morning instead of 11 p.m., do some finishing touches on that EU and publish it. So I think that it should really be a partnership, not a takeover.
We need Congress to break the back of the bureaucracy that is developed for very good reasons. This isn't like some finger poking people in the eye. It's the nature of bureaucracy. And I had a horrifying story the other day with a gentleman that owns provides butts and seats for the IC. And they were bidding on a contract for, I won't give the numbers because I don't want him to get in trouble. It was several hundred butts and seats for analytical positions. He wanted to rewrite the proposal because he felt he could do it instead of several hundred, he could do it with 40 people using machine learning and other tools that already exist. And of course, his corporate hierarchy said, you bet, and he was the boss, basically said, shut the you-know-what up, because that's not what they're asking for, just give them what they asked for. And so back to reinventing the intelligence community, I think it's not gonna happen from within, not a criticism, it's gonna have to come from Congress. And I think there are ways to really transform the thing using new tools.
When I think, is this gonna cost analysts and collectors their jobs? I don't think necessarily, particularly if we start thinking about how those roles will have to shift. So when I was thinking about like the data collectors, historically I think they've thought of themselves as, say, like investigative journalists who are out there seeking the clues to piece them all together. Whereas in reality, data collectors going forward are going to be more like, they'll be more akin to programmers, teaching the machine, the generative AI, what they're supposed to be looking for to bring to the analysts. And the analysts, I think, to Emily's point, rather than spending a ton of time on text that is really the writing and editing thereof has consumed so much of their time in the past, they can then just be that sanity check that looks, make sure, hey, is this a complete report? Is it accurate based upon my years of experience? And therefore, overall, when combined, I think generative AI is going to lead to an exponential increase in the amount of actual usable intelligence reaching the decision makers.
Apologies for the short panel. We didn't get to the most controversial parts of Soldier Secretary, but go buy the book and read it. Yeah. Also, I had a question. I didn't know this until last night, but Emily published a great report at CSIS, 7 critical technologies for winning the next war. There's some great intelligence applications in there. And thank you to all of you. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you for attending. This was a widely successful attended event, so we look forward to hosting more of these in the future. If we could just give our panelists a round of applause. I encourage all of you to visit the Special Operations Association of America's website. It's www.soaa.org. And the OSINT Foundation's website as well, so it's osintfoundation.com. Thank you again for attending.